correct. No, actually, I was going to bed last night. I was thinking.
Good. Well, good morning. Good morning, friends. Great to see you all here this morning. We thought just to help everyone wake up a little bit, we'd start by singing together, and then we'll give a few announcements and a brief introduction. Then we'll hear more from Dr. Gordon. So if you want, by the way, there's a lecture outline there on the table, just in the entryway before you come into the worship hall. So make sure you've grabbed that sheet there, two-sided, the lecture outline to help you follow along this morning. But let's grab our Trinity Psalter hymnals. And why don't we'll stand together and just to stretch our legs, help wake up. Number 275, we'll stand together, we'll sing to God's praise, Arise, my soul, arise. Amen. You may be seated. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Let me open us with a word of prayer. I'll give a brief introduction and then turn it over to Dr. Gordon. Let's pray. Our great God and Heavenly Father, we do praise you for this day you've made. We thank you for this time together. Thank you for this church family. Thank you for giving safe passage and travel to Dr. Gordon, bringing him to us, and for this time that we could spend together thinking about these things, thinking about certainly digital means and media, but thinking about the ways in which our own thinking and perceiving and certainly discipleship has been affected by the culture in which we live. We pray, O Lord, that we would take this time and use these hours and these things we're thinking about for the better renewing of our minds as we seek to grow into fuller and stronger and grown disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we pray you bless our conversation and our fellowship, bless our time in studying these things and in pondering these things. Be with us throughout all this weekend and all that we undertake, and all to the glory of King Jesus we ask it. Amen. Well, if you weren't here with us yesterday evening, we're so delighted to have Dr. T. David Gordon here with us this weekend. Dr. Gordon received his bachelor's, his undergraduate study in Roanoke College in Virginia, went on to earn an MAR and a THM from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, and his PhD from Union Theological Seminary in Virginia. For a number of years, he served as a professor of New Testament and Greek at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Massachusetts, in fact, from 1984 to 1988, and then professor of Greek and Religious Studies at Grove City College from 1999 to 2021. So he's been retired for a few years now, but still active in serving churches in various ways, and presbytery and things of that nature, as he's with us here this weekend. And it's a funny thing because Sarah, my wife, had Dr. Gordon as a professor at Grove City College for a few classes. I never did. I never had a Dr. Gordon class, and it's one of those odd things where I've gotten to know Dr. Gordon better post my undergraduate studies over the years, just in shared involvements in the PCA, shared involvements, things like the Reformation Worship Conference at Midway Church with David Hall and so forth. And it's been a delight to grow in that friendship and in that connection, and so we're so thrilled to have him here with us this weekend at Covenant. And so without further ado, Dr. Gordon, I'll turn the podium over to you, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Appreciate it. Good morning. We knew when Sean was a student at Grove City College that he was a remarkably discriminating and discerning young man, partly because he married Sarah Paris and partly because he didn't take any of my classes. So we knew he knew what he was doing at that point, and it's good to be here with you. I've known Nick even longer than I've known Sean, so we go back 35 years maybe, something like that. It's a long time, which ages us both a little bit. I want to do a few things with you this morning. I provide handouts to my lectures for several reasons. Sometimes you can see the Roman numerals and how it's developing, and you may already know everything that needs to be known about points 1 and 3, but then you know to look more carefully at points 4 and 2, that kind of a thing. Also, I encourage you, if there's something that you might want to ask a question about, in the right-hand side or the left, wherever you want to, put a little question mark, and then later, if we have a season of question and answer, right, because you asked a good question last night, you can then, that's a way to remind yourself to follow up on that a little bit. Let me say by introduction then that the thread holding these thoughts together is my teaching of media ecology for 18 years. So I studied it for about 35 and taught it for the last 18 years I was at Grove City College. It's a horrible label for a remarkable thing, right? When I tell people I taught media ecology, they get a gag reflex, most of them. And I say, no, actually, it's a fascinating discipline because it's the study of how the presence or absence of certain media alter the social structures of a culture, and they also alter the neurological structures of the human. And so the oral cultures that don't have writing, for instance, they're fundamentally different people than people who can read. And the way they commune with one another is different and so forth. They tend to use the first person plural instead of the first person singular. They say we instead of I. They have a more tribal sense of who they are. And so oral cultures have different qualities to them that could be studied by social psychologists and others, then do other things. So media ecology, while an awkward title invented by Marshall McLuhan, is actually a very fascinating field of study, because the media that saturate a culture become second nature to us. We become blind to them. So I used to ask my students to illustrate one of the points that I wanted to make. I used to ask them, why do you speak English? And there is one or maybe two good answers to it, but I never got those answers. The two most common reactions when I said, why do you speak English? The two most common answers I got was, what's wrong with English? And everyone speaks English, right? Neither of which is at all correct, right? I didn't say there was anything wrong with it. I said, why do you speak English, right? And they've never thought about it. If you grow up in a culture that speaks English, it doesn't even occur to you to raise the question of why you speak English. But the answer is because that was the primary medium of your culture. And so something that influences us profoundly, the very language that we use, which means that the authors we read versus the authors we don't read, something that important and significant to us, is a matter that we didn't choose. We were born into it. And so media ecology studies the history of the various media that have influenced humanity, including language, and oral or written, and they study how those realities influence individuals and how they influence cultures. And so it's actually the most fascinating thing I've studied other than the Bible itself, because I've been reading in media ecology for 35 or 40 years now, teaching it for the last 18, so from 2003 to 2021 every year, and I still find it as fascinating as anything other than Holy Scripture itself, which is about as high praise as you can give something. It's just a remarkably interesting discipline. It's profoundly interdisciplinary because it's a very new discipline academically. When I taught my course the first time in 2003, the people at the Media Ecology Association said it was the only undergraduate course on media ecology in North America. Now, at the graduate level, Neil Postman was teaching it at NYU at the time. Walter Ong at the graduate level was teaching it in St. Louis, of course. Marshall McLuhan had been teaching it in Toronto for years. But at the undergraduate level, it wasn't even taught. So it's very, very new. And the good thing is that means deans haven't ruined it yet. All right? And so, for instance, many of the important people, some of them on the bibliography on your page too, many of them are scientists. Some of them are, their training is English literature. Some of them, their training is social psychology. You have some neurobiologists on that list and so forth. So what happens now is it's a very fascinating and interesting discipline because people trained in other disciplines contribute to it. Whereas almost everything else at the academic level is very narrow, right? That all of the people you read in a course on social psychology are social psychologists, right? And all the way through. But right now, media ecology is just profoundly interdisciplinary and is therefore almost endlessly interesting. And we have very little canned jargon in media ecology because, again, we don't even have an introductory textbook to it where we're told to use these words to describe this phenomenon and these words to describe that and so forth. And so it's a very lively discipline. It hasn't been killed by administrators yet. They probably will kill it within the next 30 years because they have the Midas touch in reverse and they will eventually kill it. But for right now, it's a very interesting thing. So if you're looking for the common thread, my thoughts last night, today, and tomorrow, including both sermons tomorrow, are deeply informed by my studies of media ecology. So I want to give you a little quote from a culture almost 400 years removed from ours now, from Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. So a culture prior to the Industrial Revolution, way prior to electricity, certainly prior to digital stuff, and electrical noisemakers and that sort of a thing. So Pascal, as some of you recall, was a very devout Christian and a very thoughtful person. And he collected in a journal through his life various thoughts. And so when he published Pensées, that's what it is in French, thoughts. He was hoping to organize his thoughts, and he was beginning the process of determining how to take these otherwise random thoughts, kind of like Alexander's thoughts on preaching that some of you have read. It's random thoughts with very little organization to them. But he died before he could organize them. And his friends thought the world would be better served by his disorganized thoughts than by not having his thoughts. And so they're just kind of random, but they're quite profound and insightful. So here's one of his interesting ones from the 17th century, which was a quieter century than ours by a long shot. Imagine no motor noise throughout the day and how quiet that would be. And imagine no speakers, no one having audio speakers producing sound that way. And you realize it was, comparatively speaking, a quieter century than ours. And yet he said this. He said, all men's miseries derive from the inability to sit in a quiet chamber alone. All men's miseries derive from the inability to sit in a quiet chamber alone. And this he said in a time when you could find a silent chamber. Today you probably couldn't. But even when there were silent chambers, nobody wanted to be in them, he said. Isn't that fascinating? And of course, he didn't explain his thoughts. So we have to go back and try to guess why he said what he said. And I think it was something like this. A good long look at the human soul is terrifying. And we don't want to do it. And so, when Bloom wrote his book on Shakespeare called The Invention of the Human, he wasn't crediting creatorship to Shakespeare, but he was observing that Shakespeare presents constantly the human as a conflicted being, to be or not to be, you see. And so in that sense, he invented the human condition by helping us to see that the human is conflicted. Now, sometimes in his comedies, the whole thing becomes a comedy of errors, and the conflict becomes entertaining and amusing. And in the tragedies, it's a tragic conflict. His ignoble characters, unfortunately, always have something noble about them as well. And that's what makes it tragic. And so people who've studied Shakespeare said, he has more lines of soliloquy per play than any other English author. And that's because he always puts a single character out there, not responding to another character, but alone with himself and with the people who listen. And he's wrestling with his conflictedness, right? So my suspicion is that's what Pascal is talking about. We don't like to go into quiet chambers alone because there we're confronted with the fact that on many days our less noble self seems to win out over the nobler self. And the to-do list that we thought we would have completed by the time we were 30, it's not yet completed when we're 69. And so he said even in a time when people could find quiet chambers, they didn't want to be there, and all of our misery came from that. That's what we need. So what does that mean for a generation like ours where it's nearly impossible to find a quiet chamber? Your cell phone will buzz or ring. Your computer will annoy you, right? Someone else's in the next room will do something like that. And wherever you are, there are constant things disrupting any opportunity for quiet meditation and reflection. And so we almost cannot now do what Pascal said we didn't want to do, but could have done in his day. And now it's nearly impossible to find a quiet chamber. One of the unwitting results of central heating in the early 20th century was houses are not quiet anymore. If you go into an old rural home from the 19th century and earlier, ordinarily there's a large front porch and then a hallway, a central hallway that runs all the way back to the kitchen area of the home. And then each of the rooms off of that hallway have doors on them because they didn't want to start a fire in every fireplace in the house every day. They only would put a fire in the fireplace in rooms that they were using on that day because it's a lot of work to stoke a fire and keep it going. And so those houses were marvelously, blessedly quiet because what was going on in one room wouldn't necessarily be heard in the other rooms. But once we had central heating, open architecture became the norm. By the mid-20th century, I'd say by World War II. Not that this town has any knowledge of World War II, but other towns do have a little knowledge of World War II. And by World War II, many homes now, when you come in the front door, you can see the dining room here, the living room here, the den back there, the kitchen over here. And I kind of like that because I like visually the open house because the sun will come through somewhere almost all day long. Whereas in these older homes I was referring to earlier, if you're on the wrong side of the house, you're not on the south side of the house, they're dark. So I love visually the newer homes, but I don't like them auditorily because they're noisy, right? They're just noisy. And we adjust to it, and so it doesn't bother us, but it's a reality that we have. So what I'm going to suggest then is a few thoughts about human attentiveness, human attention giving, in light of Pascal's observation that we would need, in some sense, a quiet chamber to do it in, and now we live in a place where there are no quiet chambers. And what does that mean for us? So I title it, Hear, O Israel, because as you recall, the first part of the Shema is Shema Israel, right? And it's still in the synagogues today. It's still a part of the Jewish liturgy, whether Orthodox or conservative or liberal Jews. They still have the Shema every Sunday. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. This is what they do. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Because they lived in a polytheistic world, and for them, God is one, He's not many. And so they always began everything with that. But what you and I overlook when we read it is we think of the content, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. But it starts with, Hear, O Israel, Shema, as Yahweh asserts His prerogative as the maker of all things to address all things and expect their attention. And so He calls attention to them first, and then He says a very significant thing, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. But first He says, Shema, hear, O Israel. And so He demands their attention, as it were. And one would think it would have been undivided attention in His case, and ideally so. So I want to talk about the challenges to attention and to attentiveness in the 21st century. The challenge began in the late 20th century because by then you had radio and television. And another way of saying radio or television is unsolicited noise-making device, right? Because if someone else in the house has decided to listen to Bob Marley and the Wailers, guess who else is going to hear Bob Marley and the Wailers? You are, right? And you can be sure that if your brother is down the hall listening to ZZ Top, he doesn't have them on a low volume. He's got Billy Gibbons and Frank Beard. You know, those guys are just going, right? They're doing their thing. Now, one of the diseasers is passed away. He said, Billy Gibbons is still living and Frank Beard is still living. So Dusty Hill passed away, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. So I think they're no longer performing with just 2 of the 3. But whenever they did perform, they were not quiet. I think we can put it that way. I saw George Thorogood open for ZZ Top in Roanoke once, and Thorogood wasn't quiet either. Neither Thorogood nor ZZ Top were quiet, and everyone was happy that they weren't. But imagine that in the house. Once you have radios and televisions, it's hard to find a quiet room. And my older sister, who retired from teaching in Norfolk, Virginia, and Virginia Beach, Virginia, for 40 or 50 years, every 5 or 6 years, there are new studies done about why students are underperforming. And at one time, it was simple nourishment. They were not adequately nourished. And we realized this was happening across the country. And so nourishment programs in schools became more common, and now they're everywhere to make sure people have the sheer bodily energy, chemically and so forth, to do the kind of work that they're supposed to do. But in her latter years, she was saying that they said that the primary thing that holds them up is none of them live in quiet homes. They're trying to learn to read, and they're trying to figure out see spot, run spot, run. And they've got other people in the house playing computer games and listening to music and doing other things. And they can't focus, they can't concentrate, they can't give attention to the matters that they're trying to learn. And so distraction, as we will see, is the opposite of attention. And without it, things get tough. So your Roman numeral 1, neurogenesis, right, is the technical term that neurobiologists use. They also use its synonym, neuroplasticity, to refer to the fact that within our brains, the synapses that are there today will not be the same synapses that are there tomorrow. So the pathways between the 7 lobes of the brain are constantly changing. The 7 lobes of the brain, barring an accident or being shot in the head or something, the 7 lobes will remain basically what they are. But the synaptic pathways that connect them is constantly changing. And what causes them to change is sort of random. When you do an activity where one part of the brain tries to connect to another, it begins the process of making a trail, as it were, to it, a pathway. And so the brain is not fixed when we're born, and it's not fixed when we're 5 years old, which was thought until about 30 years ago. And now everyone realizes that neurogenesis continues through life, and the brain's constantly building new synaptic pathways. And so the brain basically rewires itself constantly. And that accounts for the fact that many of the things we endeavor to do, whether they're more manual things with our hands or more intellectual things with our minds, many of those things that we work on for a while, we suddenly find at some point that we can do them, and we couldn't before. And we wonder why that is. And the answer is the brain is adjusted and has learned how to do it. So when I started spending a little bit more time in the forest 10 or 12 years ago than I had before, I just hike in with my hammock and a tarp and hang between two trees in the forest somewhere, make a small fire and spend the evening in the woods serenading the coyotes when they don't serenade me. And when I first started doing this, it took me an enormous amount of effort and time to tie a simple taut line hitch, which is, if you had to have one knot in the woods, that's probably your most useful knot. And it's a very simple knot, the taut line hitches. It was very, very difficult for me to learn it. I found it easier to learn the bowline knot after that, a little bit easier after that to learn probably the Prusik knot after that, I suppose I did, and have learned a few others since then. What I found is I was not only learning how to tie new knots, but I was learning to tie knots faster each time. My brain had learned how to tie knots. And it no longer looked at those diagrams and was puzzled by them. Now when I looked at the same diagrams, I could see why and how it was doing what it was doing. My brain was different. It's probably very retarded in every other area since then because of my current age. That you don't suddenly die. We start dying when we're 30, I think, and we just keep working and get closer to it. But my brain is a better knot tying brain than it used to be. I can learn new knots now more easily. Sometimes I'll actually look up a YouTube video and just learn a new knot for the sheer joy of it, right? Which is kind of crazy. And that's just one very simple example of neuroplasticity. That when people say when they're in fourth grade, "Dad, I'm just not good at math," Dad's answer ought to be, "Honey, you're just not good at math yet." Right? But you may very well become very good at it. I dropped Greek the first time I took it my freshman year in college. I eventually taught it for 42 years. I think I got the hang of it at some point, right? But the early results were not auspicious, right? And so one of the reasons I became a fairly good Greek professor is I didn't make the mistakes of those who tried to teach it to me, which is to assume that everyone already knows Latin. If you assume that and it's not true, people who do not know Latin can't learn to translate Greek into English. They've got more work to do than needs to be done. See, you can train your brain to do things that it's not currently trained to do. And we call this neuroplasticity because the brain is changing, or neurogenesis because it's constantly generating new synaptic pathways. And it also gives hope to stroke victims, right, who have had damage at times, and then over certain amounts of time, some of them reacquire capacities that they had lost because the brain builds another bridge from one part of the brain to the other. I had a friend who was a ruling elder in New York, Ballston Spa, New York, up north of Albany. And he had a stroke years after we moved to Grove City College, and he lost his ability to speak. And he would sit in the room, they had a sunroom, and they'd go there after breakfast. Marilyn was very, very crafty. She would knit and crochet and do all sorts of things. And he would sit there and look at the Trinity hymnal, and after a while he started singing hymns. He couldn't talk, but he could sing hymns. And then eventually his brain learned to connect the hymn singing part of the brain to the speech part of the brain. So one day he's singing Fairest Lord Jesus, and he looks over across the room to Marilyn and says, "Marilyn, that's a lovely hymn, isn't it?" She says, "Yes, George, and you just spoke," right? And his brain had rewired itself, right? And now he was speaking again. And he didn't start off speaking like a child. He started off his old New York accent that he'd always had before. Next time I saw him, he sounded like he'd never had a stroke, right? But for like 8 or 9 months, he couldn't speak. And then his brain rewired itself and got around the impediment and fixed it. So when I'm out in the woods, for instance, hiking, one of the things I notice is there are maintained trails. That we have 51 miles of trail in the little forest I spend time in. And if you're in a hurry to get to some particular place, the trails are very, very useful because you're not fighting through brush, or in our case, glacial moraines, because underneath all the leaves in Pennsylvania forest are stones, right? Because as the glaciers receded, they dropped all these rocks in there. And so when you're off trail, it's a little bit arduous because you have to be careful not to break an ankle, and you have to make sure that you can find your way to where you're going. But I still do it because if you want to see wildlife, you'll never see it on the trail because the wildlife don't like humans. They're sort of antisocial that way, I would think. They make good Presbyterian deacons and elders and pastors, come to think of it. They're just antisocial enough. So if you want to really see the forest, you get off trail. That's what I do. And what I sometimes find when I'm off trail is I find what some of you call game trails. And if you don't know what that means, a game trail is a trail that's not maintained by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation. It's a trail where deer walking to get water, after a while they follow other deer because the other deer have tramped it down a little bit and cut through some of the undergrowth. And so the game make their own trails. We call them game trails. They're not as well maintained as the ones maintained by the Pennsylvania DCNR, but they do make trails, right? And that's what your brain does. It's constantly make trails. And they're made by using. And when you use your brain to try to tie a taut line hitch, before long you can learn to tie a bowline knot because your brain is learning not tie. And this is why some of you have tried to sharpen your axe or you've sharpened your knife and you say it never works. I'll take the stone to it and I do what the video says. You have to, at some point there's a breakthrough and you realize the spine of that knife, needs to be just absolutely straight and very fine. Which means if you're cutting at a 22.5 degree angle on this side of the knife, you've got to do a 22.5 angle on the other side. And once you figure that out and you develop a feel for it, then you start finding that when you take your stone and sharpen, you get it sharp, really sharp, almost shaving sharp. Now, I sometimes use my grandfather's straight razor to shave just out of emotional attachment, I suppose. And I never get my knives as sharp as that razor is. But then I use 5,000 stone and 8,000 and 10,000 Japanese stones on that razor, right? It really is sharp. But you can get a knife really sharp once you get a feel for what you're actually doing when you sharpen it. And the reason it's 22.5 degrees most of the time, by the way, is we all know how to do 90 degrees from the vertical. And 45 degrees is half of 90, and 22.5 is half of 45. So at some point, the industry just sort of settled on 22.5 because you could kind of figure it out without having some kind of a special device on there, and you get it done. So the brain does this. It all adjusts to what it needs to. And that's why a child reared in France develops a good ear for French, and a child reared in the United States develops a good ear for English. Your brain hears this, and then it eventually learns how to emulate it and imitate it and do it itself. But as you're born, you don't have a language. It's a learned thing, and your brain learns to do it. And so that's great. People who are reared in homes that have music, good music, properly played and tuned, develop a better sense of pitch. I was humming the pitch today before we sang the opening A, and I was right. So sometimes you get those things. So if you're around music, after a while, you develop pitch, and if you're not around it, it's kind of an ancient and foreign concept, right? But the more around it you are, the more you go. So the brain, in order to read, by the way, has to create synaptic pathways between three particular lobes of the brain: the visual, the auditory, and the third is the conceptual. And so there are three lobes of the brain associated largely with those three things. And when the child is born, there are no synaptic pathways between all three of those lobes. So the reason it seemed like it took so long to learn to read when you were younger, and you can still remember being younger, right? And you remember how hard it seemed to be to learn to read, it's because your brain was not yet up to the task. It couldn't do it, right? It could no more read than I can dunk basketballs, right? It just couldn't do it. But in the effort to learn to do it, eventually synaptic pathways, bridges were developed between those three parts of the brain, and then you got the hang of it. that you would see letters and say, that's a Q, that's a W. And then you would phoneticize, at least in your head, the sound of a W or a Q or a T or an R, what it is. And then you would put it all together. And it sounds like cat. It's probably a furry thing that's planning to take over the world, right? At that point, you knew what it was. And so without neuroplasticity, no one would read and no one could read, because we are not born biologically with those three lobes of the brain connected. So this is a great thing. It's a great reality. Media ecologists knew about this before the fMRI, before neurobiologists could trace it. They knew the phenomenon was there. And they used to say things that the sensoria, which is the cluster of senses in the mind, they would say that the sensoria are flexible, or the sensoria are flexible. They had observed the reality that people developed capacities, and they didn't know the neurobiological basis of it until the fMRI. And now, of course, with fMRIs, you can actually look at a living brain, right? And you learn a lot more about electrical activity from a living brain than a dead one, because there's no electrical activity in a dead brain. So this has been a breakthrough in the last 30 years in neurobiology. It is probably the most fascinating field of study today is neurobiology, because they're starting from scratch with this brand new tool. They're learning to do things that could not have been done before. If you see the expression sensoria, you see it at the concluding paragraph, the bottom of that first paragraph, Roman numeral 1, the notion that the sensoria are plastic. Sensoria is a term that the media ecologists used to use to describe the five senses, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and the two properties of the brain. And from the ancient world to the present, when people talk about the brain or the mind's two capacities, they don't always use the same words to describe it, but they mean the same two things, which are roughly the rational part and the imaginative part. So the brain, as it were, has an accelerator and a brake, right? The imaginative part is the accelerator. That's what happens when you sleep, right? The brain just takes off and does whatever it wants with no brake. And then you wake up and you say, gosh, that's just crazy, right? There I am dunking on Shaquille O'Neal. Well, that's just nuts, right? Those two properties of the brain, and by the way, until the 20th century, roughly, or late 19th, most people thought the imaginative faculty of the brain was more important than the rational faculty. The rational faculty says, no, that will never work, right? And so it's good to have it. It's a brake. But it's the imaginative faculty that learns how to make a suspension bridge, for instance. It's the imaginative faculty that helped Henry Bessemer learn how to turn iron into steel. And now you can make buildings that were more than 4 stories high, because iron gets brittle under a certain amount of load, under its own load, right? Steel can still flex. And so the people who learn to do these new things for the human race, who are imaginative, have a wonderful faculty. This is a wonderful property of the mind. But after the sort of Enlightenment and Enlightenment rationalism, people came to prefer the rational to the imaginative, but I think it was a mistake to have done so. At any rate, the brain has both properties. And so when media ecologists say the sensoria are plastic, what they're acknowledging is what we now call neuroplasticity, that what we do with our 5 senses and do with our brain is what tomorrow's brain will become. What we attempt to do today is what it learns to do tomorrow or many days later, that sort of a thing. This is why, for those of you who've had the joy of studying upper-level mathematics, I haven't. Those who've had the joy of doing that, you realize you're building on one thing after another. So when you're first studying the calculus, you study derivatives and you study limits, and you first have to learn what derivatives are. I don't know. What I know about derivatives is itself derived. And then you have to learn about limits, and I don't know about limits either. As x approaches 0, my understanding approaches 0. So I don't know that either, right? But for people learning the fundamental theorem, they learn one abstract thing, then they learn another abstract thing. They put all 3 together, and voila, you've got the fundamental theorem. And that's a very creative, imaginative mind that Newton and Leibniz both came up with and argued forever about who did it right and proved it first and so forth. But they were both bright people, very imaginative people. So then, let me take this idea of neuroplasticity into the arena of attention and suggest to you that at the current state of the conversation, neurobiologists are saying the human mind has the potential capacity for 3 different kinds of attentiveness, 3 different kinds of attention. And in no particular order, one of them is called orienting attention. Orienting attention is when we especially find ourselves in a new situation and we're just sort of aware of everything. New smells, new sounds, new sights, all sorts of different things going on. Maybe we walk into the food freezer at the Pizza Hut if we're a youngster working at the pizza place. You feel cold when you go in there to get something out of the cold storage and so forth. And so when the wildlife officers release an animal that's been injured back to the forest, when they release the animal, one of the first things that happens is the animal orients. You know, the deer have ears that are so large we would swear they were rabbits if they weren't otherwise so graceful. But they move more silkily than the rabbit does, and so we admire their other things about them. Deer have very big ears themselves, and they have a wonderful nose. Unlike the human nose, where the smelling part's on the inside, many animals have the smelling part on the outside. Dogs do, for instance, right? Wonderful smelling capacities. When you release an animal to the forest like that, probably the first thing their orienting thing does is move away from sudden noises and sniff for water. Because like us, they're about 3/4 water, and they need it, and so they find water that way. We find it rationally. We know that it flows downhill. If I'm in a new forest and want to refill my water bottle, I go downhill. If you go down long enough, you'll find water. That's just the way it is. Now, I don't know if you're out west. You may not find it even then. If you're in Death Valley, just give it up, all right? Just say, glory be to Jesus, and die, right? There's no hope at that point. But humans know if we go downhill, we're going to find water, this side of the Mississippi. If you go downhill, you'll find water. The deer has no concept of that at all. But the deer has a good nose and can smell it. And so the deer orients himself that way. So orienting attention is a common thing that many forms of animate life have. And then the species that survive in the woods always have excellent alarming attention, which is also called by some people alerting attention. Alarming attention and alerting attention are the same thing. They're 2 words for the same reality. And of course, alarming attention or alerting attention is the ability to quickly switch from what we're doing to something else. And the species that can do that well survive in the woods. Because if you're a small animal in the woods and you hear a twig snap, that means a large predator is on the way. Smaller animals don't snap twigs in the woods. When I'm sleeping in my hammock at night, if I don't hear a twig snap, all the other noise in the woods doesn't bother me at all. Little creatures running around in the forest, chipmunks, even a chipmunk doesn't have a chance against Gordon, armed or otherwise, right? And so I don't mind those little guys scurrying around, but if I hear a twig snap, it's a larger animal. And probably a pretty large black bear or deer or something like that, elk. It'd be a larger animal to do that. So the animals that survive in the woods are the animals that have excellent alarming attention. The ability to quickly focus on something else other than what they were focusing on, because that's how they survive. And many brains, including the human brain, secrete a little dopamine every time you switch your attention from one thing to another. And that's why the digital devices are so chemically addictive. They're not merely psychologically addictive, but the human brain loves to switch attention from one thing to another. And that's why the people who purvey the various digital softwares always design them to constantly change, because they know that they can hook you. That you may not be conscious of it, but you're hooked to the dopamine release that comes every time you switch attention. So studies were done 40 years ago now about television, and in the early days, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, how long a scene was on television. And I don't mean the scene in the sense that a dramatist would describe an act with a scene in it, but for how long what you see through the television doesn't change. And it was on average 42 to 45 seconds back then. And then maybe they would switch over to camera number 2 and get another angle on the thing, something like that. And then they noticed that by the 80s it had dropped to 15 to 20 seconds. And by the turn of the millennium, it was 3 seconds. And so now on average, when you're watching television, every 3 seconds, either something new enters the thing or the camera angle changes. And they do that because that's what hooks you. It literally addicts you because you can't pull yourself away from it. And so what we now live in is a circumstance in which we have probably the same orienting attention abilities we once had. We have hyper alarming attentions, but we have almost no executive attention. So executive attention is the opposite of alarming. Executive attention is where you say, I don't care if someone's honking a horn out there or if their security device is beeping. I'm going to learn this fundamental theorem of the calculus before I die, right? And so you stay with it. When we call that executive attention. People who play tournament level chess, for instance, have extraordinary executive attention because they can imagine the next 3 or 4 moves. And of course, I don't mean literally, but all the potentials that could lead to those 3 or 4 moves, which is a remarkable matter of concentration. So those people have extraordinary executive attention. So if you can imagine, had you been parenting 15 years ago, and you had twin boys who were, let's say, 14, and one of them wanted to join the chess club at school, and the other one wanted to play computer games at school, have computer game contests. And you were thinking as parents, which one will better serve our boys before they go off to university or college? And you know what answer you would have come up with, wouldn't you? Right? You would have either negatively rewarded the one or positively the other, but you know perfectly well that a kid who plays 2 hours of chess every afternoon is going to develop one really wonderful noggin, right? Wonderful executive attention. And the person that plays a computer game that never gives you 3 seconds, it gives you less than 0.3 of a second, right? You do enough of that long enough, and you have wonderful alarming attention, which would be great if you lived in the woods and bears were after you, right? But if you're not living in the woods and bears are not after you, right, maybe you'd be better served if your executive attention were better developed. So the big problem or deficit of the digital world is that the rapid disruption creates a distracted mind. And the mind, like muscles, can't rewire itself daily. Neuroplasticity happens, but it doesn't happen rapidly. And so if your normal waking moments are constantly distracted, and then you need to concentrate on something tomorrow. Maybe you're making a risotto, and the rice almost turns to glue towards the end, so you have to stir it more frequently as you put in the chicken broth to it. And you don't have to watch it much at first, but the longer it's in that pan, the more attention you have to give to it. Well, if you forget for a couple minutes at the wrong time to stir the risotto, it's going to stick to the bottom of the pan, and you're going to have risotto glue and not risotto to eat. Right? So there are times, or balancing the checkbook, or doing your, dare we say it, taxes, the second most certain thing in life, that sometimes you need to actually focus on things and give them attention. And if you haven't used that part of the mind and cultivated it, you can't just pull it up at will. If any of the young men here wanted to have a contest that a year from now they're going to see who can do 100 push-ups in one set, you can't just by willpower do it. You might could do 10, 12, or 20 today, and then 22 tomorrow, and then a week later 25, and a week after that 30, and before long you do 100. By the way, I'll take any of you up on an offer on it, see if we can do 100 by next year, because I think I can do 65 right now. So if I can do 65 now in a year, I think I can do 35 more. So we could get there. And it's the same way with the synapses in the brain. They change, but they don't change rapidly. And so people today really don't have well-developed executive attention span. It's the common problem we have. So note there under your Roman numeral 2, uppercase letter D, important learning requires executive attention. Most of the significant learning that we do, other than very routine and menial tasks, requires a certain amount of executive attention. It requires executive attention to sharpen a knife. It does. Or to sharpen an axe. It requires concentration. It's lack of concentration that causes you to roll the thing and the angle goes off and you end up with a dull piece of tool that won't cut. So some of you have read Mortimer Adler. Many of you have read his How to Read a Book, which is a very, very good book in most ways. The content is wonderful. I read it 3 or 4 times and I had to buy a second copy at one point because the spine was broken on the first copy. So I wore it out. Got my money's worth, but wore it out. But he also wrote a book called A Guidebook to Learning. in which he studied the history of education and the history of encyclopedia making, especially with information about Encyclopedia Britannica, which decided not to choose between whether they studied large things or small things, but they did both parts in Encyclopedia Britannica. And so, but in his guidebook to learning, he says, if you look at the history of education, you'll see this little thing that I put there is number one, is the movement from information to knowledge to understanding to wisdom. He said from the ancient world until roughly the 19th century, mid-19th century, the goal of all learning was wisdom. And wisdom is that faculty of knowing how to live, what decisions to make, what choices to make. But to get to wisdom, you need understanding. You need to understand how certain things work to make a wise choice when you confront them. And so understanding precedes wisdom. And then we learn that what we want to understand can be helpfully understood if there's knowledge before that. And so knowledge is when we take otherwise disparate information and put it together. And information is just data. So let me reverse it and go about it the other way. You see something hopping across the backyard, you're 9 years old, and you want to go get it. It doesn't have fuzz or fur, so it's not the Easter rabbit. It's probably something in the toad or frog family, right? And so you go out there, and your brother says, oh, pick it up. Does it bite? No, it doesn't. Oh, well, then I'll pick it up. Well, it doesn't bite, but what it does do is urinate in your hand. We all know that that's just what they live for. Apparently, this is, a big day, a red-letter day for a frog or for a toad is to urinate in somebody's hand. And so now you have information, right? You have this information about this particular animal. Then you may find that either the frog or the toad is amphibian. I guess the frog is amphibian, the toad is not. Once you've categorized it as amphibian, it will have traits that other amphibians have. Now you have knowledge, not just the information about one species, but when you see its relation to others that share similar traits, you now have knowledge. Then you say, what can be done with frogs? Well, if you're in Texas, they'd probably make boots out of them. They make boots out of everything in Texas, right? I'm afraid they'd make it out of small Greek professors, so I don't even go to Texas anymore. Those guys are nuts. You can probably make boots out of them. The legs fried up in a pan are just delicious. You can eat them, right? And if you're still 8 years old, there's a third thing you can do with a frog. You can put it under your sister's pillow before bedtime, just for amusement's sake, right? And so you can eat them, you can make shoes out of them, and you can entertain yourself as you watch your sister scream. These are all, now you've got understanding. It's beyond knowledge that this is an amphibian that pees. Now you also have understanding because you know some of the things that it can do. But then the ability to make the right choice is a matter of wisdom. And Adler says the goal of all learning is ultimately wisdom. To get there, we have to normally go through this process of information that's then organized into knowledge. We understand the properties of things that are in that category, and then we can begin to make wise choices out of them. But you see that on any given matter, that's kind of a lengthy process, isn't it? That might require some executive attention. You have to know what the thing is, what classes to put it in. Is it a reptile? Is it an amphibian? Is it cold-blooded? Is it red-blooded? These kinds of questions you have to ask. What can be done with all those things? So you realize that any learning that's at all consequential requires executive attention, because at some point that whole process needs to be gone through. My way of putting it is more psychological. I call it a belief spectrum. It's just there on your thing below, Adler's spectrum. And my supposition is that we use the word belief or believe in English for at least 4 different things. And that's okay. I'm not playing grammar cop here saying we should or shouldn't do that. I'm just saying we do. So sometimes we use the word belief to describe what is technically actually a presupposition or a bias or a prejudice. Where if we say, well, I work with George, and I think he believes that black people are racially inferior. And if you said, George, do you believe that? He says, I don't think so, right? And the reason is George has probably never thought about it. It's a prejudice, right? He hasn't even thought about the matter. He's not even conscious of it, right? And he would probably immediately say no. But you call it his belief because the way he acts, you think, demonstrates that that's what he believes. So sometimes when we say belief, it's actually a prejudice. If it becomes self-conscious and the person's aware of it, I would call it an opinion. He's aware now that he has an idea. Do you prefer chopsticks to forks when you're eating Oriental food, you might say? And if a person says, oh, I always like the chopsticks, prefer the chopsticks, right? Now the person's aware of it, and so it's not a prejudice, but an opinion. And then once there's a certain oughtness to an opinion, then in the process of holding to that belief, you know that someone or something thinks you should believe it. So when you cite the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, there may be clauses or phrases in there you've never had the opportunity to study. But you know that you're supposed to believe them because they're in the creed, right? Right? They're in the creed. So someone thinks there's an ought to this. It ought to be believed. And so we use the word belief in that formal sense for ideas and realities of an intellectual nature that at least someone or something thinks we ought to believe. And then a conviction, I put at the end of the 4 steps. Conviction is when, in God's providence, you've had the opportunity to survey a matter for a significant period of time. You know the history of human opinion on the thing. There might be 3 opinions, or there might be 2, or there might be 4. And you've read the arguments pro and con, all of them, and you simply become persuaded and convinced that one of those views is better than the others. And it may be inconvenient for you to embrace that view, but you embrace it because you are persuaded that it's right. And we call that a conviction. When I went off to a Lutheran college, liberal Lutheran college, as a conservative Southern Baptist preparing for the Christian ministry, in the process, unfortunately, I became reformed in my theology. And the Lutherans didn't like it, and the Baptists didn't like it, right? So I was like Everett Hale's man without a country for about a year, because I was a man without a denomination, which is an awkward thing if you're preparing for the Christian ministry. You kind of need a church. It's just that way. But I was convinced that the arguments for divine sovereignty and the salvation of humans were true. And whether it was convenient or not, I was stuck with it, right? And those are convictions. You have a handful in life where you have convictions. And so for me, also, my little scale, analogous to Adler's, is I don't think anyone can develop a conviction apart from executive attention. The only things that you are absolutely convinced of, persuaded of, not just attracted to, convinced of, are things that you've looked at for a long time. And you looked at the counter arguments and the counter positions. And so no one can really have conviction without executive attention. And yet some of the most important people in human culture and human history have been people of conviction, because they're persuaded that the thing is right. So I asked David Wells, a former colleague at Gordon Conwell, many years ago, I said, David, is there not a necessary relationship between conviction and courage? And David said, 'tis so, 'tis always so. He says, people who are confused are always cowards, and people convinced are the only ones who have courage. Because to be willing to suffer or abuse or worse for a thing, you have to be convinced of its rightness. So if we become a nation of people who don't think, we'll become a nation of people who have no conviction, and that will be a nation of people without courage. We'll be C.S. Lewis's men without chests, because we don't have the conviction that drives courage. And so executive attention also has this profoundly historical power and cultural power, because people with real conviction are not easily shaken, you see, because they didn't adopt the view out of convenience. They adopted it because they were persuaded of it. And those people are hard to dispersuade, because they've already developed convictions. So as you can see at your bottom in your Roman numeral 3, where I'm going with this, that digital technologies cultivate distraction attention, alarming attention, at the expense of executive attention. Things that cause us to develop a brain that's constantly switching are things which militate developing a brain that can concentrate. And the boy who wants to do 100 push-ups next year, he won't do it by doing 1 a day for a year. At some point, he's got to do more and more. It's just the only way you're going to get there. And it's the same way that. So what happens then is our brains are now adjusted to constant distraction, to the point that most of us aren't even annoyed or bothered by it, because after all, we get dopamine from it. There's a little chemical hit that we get when our brain switches attention from one thing to another. And so we're comfortable with it. We actually desire it. In addition to Pascal's psychological reason that we're afraid of the quiet chamber alone, we're afraid to think and be quiet, there's also the reality that we're rewarded for anything that causes our attention to shift from time to time. And that's why when you go on the internet to check the weather, you find that you're still there 12 minutes later. And you could check the weather in a minute and a half, if that. It's because something else popped up. Look, a kangaroo got loose in Australia. Better check just in case. Might learn to ride a boat and get over here, right? Who knows what it might do? Might bring a rabbit with it. Those things, rabbits are everywhere over there. Kangaroo on the loose, rabbit on the loose. The place has gone wild, right? And before long, you've watched 10 minutes about kangaroos and rabbits in Australia, and you don't even live in Australia, right? When was the last Australia that was loose here in Knoxville area, right? It's been a while. Probably a long while, right? May as well worry about pandas being on the loose in Oak Ridge. So that's where we find ourselves. If the primary virtue of the digital technologies is speed, that is also their primary vice. That's also their primary vice. Did you also notice that in yourself from time to time? You're doing something digital and a thing freezes momentarily or goes slowly, and how anxious you get and impatient? Because we expect these things to be lightning fast. We psychologically expect it. We chemically expect it. And if we ever have to wait when we're online doing anything, it drives us nuts. And so I've been relieved of that for the last 24 hours because the TSA took my Kindle and my laptop and didn't tell me that they'd taken it. They took it out of my bag. So I left the airport with my carry-on bag and thought everything was in it. And I got to go back to Pittsburgh and get my laptop and my Kindle. Someone else has it right now, I think. I don't know what I'll do with my speaking engagement over the next 2 months if I don't find my computer. That's where my calendar is. There's going to be people showing up to church and no one's preaching. Right? We knew he was small, but he's not that small. Right? There's no one there. Right? But they'll have to have a small fit. So the digital world constantly distracts us. And when it no longer bothers you to be distracted, then you've already gone the other direction probably for a little too long because you've gotten used to it. By injuring executive attention, you see, the digital world tends to erode intelligence itself. It tends to erode our ability to do what we alone can do. The other animals don't have executive attention. The neurobiologists say that other animals do not have executive attention. They can't find water by figuring out that it flows downhill. They have to smell it. That's the only way they can find it. So something that's very simple for us is impossible for them. They just can't do it. And so the one thing of all the creatures God made that we could do and bring to the table, as it were, is executive attention. The others have great alarming attention. The zebra will always have a more interesting coat than we will. The kangaroo will jump higher than we will. All the other creatures can do things that we can't do, but we alone can think through things and figure them out and make sense of them. And when we sacrifice that to commercial forces, then we've sacrificed too much, and the gain may not be worth the benefit. So I want to entertain some questions, but I want to actually look at your list, the bibliography there on your page too, and say a few words about some of the authors that write in this area. And there are like two different kinds of authors in that bibliography. Some of them write about stupidity, right? I call it stupid studies. Enormous numbers of books have been written in the last 2 decades on why, on every measurable test of intelligence or knowledge, Americans are slowly declining, right? And they're writing on these kinds of things. And so some of these authors write about that. Some of them write more technically on the neurobiology of thought itself and how it works. And I'll try to make the distinction on at least a handful of them, if not bothering you with all of them. Daniel Ariely's book is absolutely fascinating. It's the kind of book you can't put down. Predictably irrational. He's a behavioral economist at Duke. And the behavioral economist distinguishes himself from traditional economists because traditional economists say, here's how the economy ought to work. Behavioral economists say, this is how it actually does work, right? So Adam Smith says the market should determine the value of a product. And so, because people will want the cheapest price for the product. So one of the examples to the contrary he writes about in his book is a study done of people shopping in grocery stores. And they get over to the canned food section and say they see 3 cans of, could be plum tomatoes or it could be green beans, right? And Del Monte and a couple other brands there. And they will look at it on the basis of the price. They'll put one of the 3 in their cart. One's more expensive, one's in the middle, one's less expensive. And if you turn the cans around, sometimes you look on the back and it'll say, produced and canned in Battle Creek, Michigan. And then you put the second one up, produced and canned in Battle Creek, Michigan. Third can says the same thing. You're going, how many canning plants do they have in Battle Creek, Michigan anyway? Those crazy Dutchmen, what are they up to, right? And he says, we discovered that they were all canned at the same plant. And the only difference was the labels. And he can predict that 86% of the people who buy the medium can will buy the medium can. And then there's about a 7 or 8% that always buy the most expensive because nothing's too good for my family, right? And then there will be some thrifty people who always buy the less expensive one. And he calls it predictably irrational because it's not just irrational, it's predictably irrational, right? Now, I don't know how that affects your budget at the end of the day. You know, what's 18 cents difference on the can or even 11 cents difference on the 2 beans, except you might have 150 things in your cart. And if it's 15 cents for each item in the cart, and you shop every week of the year, by the end of the year, he calculates there's like a $5,000 to $7,000 difference in family A versus family C, and they're buying the same product. And one of them is paying $7,000 a year more for an identical product. And so that's just a fascinating and disturbing book to read, you see, because it disproves Adam Smith's fundamental thesis that the market will take care of itself. Because he thought humans would be rational, and humans are not always rational. And so they don't even look to see if it's the same beans produced in the same plant, right? Won't be bothered with it. They just make their decision. Mark Bauerlein, teaches English in Atlanta at Emory. And you'll note the non-flattering title of his 2 books, The Dumbest Generation and then The Dumbest Generation Grows Up. And note the subtitle to the first, How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans and Jeopardizes Our Future. He's not a word mincer, right? And then in the other one, From Stupefied Youth to Dangerous Adults. And so he took the stupefied from the first book and added it to the second one in there also. That's also wonderfully disturbing and very helpful. Nicholas Carr has both his article and his book. His book, The Shallows, What the Internet's Doing to Our Brains, was predated by about a year or a year and a half and appeared as an article in Atlantic Monthly. That often happens in Atlantic Monthly. When an agent for a person who is under contract to write a book will contact the editors at Atlantic and say, would you like so-and-so to write a 30-page précis of a forthcoming 300-page book as an important article to put in Atlantic Monthly? And so that's what he did. And we'll see a couple others like that on this list. And so the quick read is his book in The Atlantic, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And then if you want to read bunches about it, read his book, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. You can get to that way. Winfried Gallagher was one of the first to talk about attention and the focused life. I say first because it wasn't really until the 3rd millennium that we had the digital technologies as rampant as we do now. And so she was one of the very first to notice the importance. And so there's an irony there, rapt attention and the focused life. She's lamenting that it's not there. And Jonathan Haidt writes stuff all the time. His work with Greg Lukianoff is good. And then this summer, his book appeared, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. Jaron Lanier is an old hippie who used to work with the computer industry, made so much money, he doesn't work anymore, doesn't need to work anymore. But he's become the leading critic of especially social media. So he's fascinating to read. I can't even reproduce one of the chapter titles in his book because it's a little obscene when he says, this is what they make you, and they do. Daniel Levitin is a neurobiologist in Toronto. He wrote 2 books on the neurology and sociology of music. He wrote a book in 2008 called This Is Your Brain on Music. And as a neurobiologist who had once been a sound producer for Steely Dan and others and stuff, he said, when I grew up, I went to graduate school. So he now studies the neurology of music. Do you know the human brain is the only brain that can discern interval? So a lot of brains can discern loud noises versus softer noises. And some can discern higher pitches than lower pitches. But the interval between pitches, which can be arithmetically measured, right? So that you can sing A Child to Sleep with Fairest Lord Jesus in an E flat one night and in an F the next night if you can reach the F natural. And you recognize it as the same tune even though the notes are not the same because the intervals between the notes are the same. So when you're going up a typical three-note scale, between the C and the G is the E natural, and the same would be true of the D natural, the F sharp, and the A. The intervals between them are the same. And the human brain is the only brain which can hear that, which means we're the only brain that can recognize melody or harmony, all of which depend upon interval, the simplest aspect of music. It's a remarkable thing. So, and then he wrote The World in 6 Songs, which is a sociology of music before the commercial taking over of music in the 20th century. Before that, music was very important. Handel composed music for the coronation of royalty. Music was sometimes associated with military activities, often with national activities, quite often with religious activities. Think of the Brahms Ein Deutsches Requiem, and very often as well with human love. And so it was never inconsequential until the period between 1890 and 1930 when they could mass produce music, and all of it's inconsequential now. In fact, they robbed music of music because musikes in Greek, is an adjective that means derived from the muses, the 7 daughters of Athena, who brought to the world everything lovely. Things so lovely we thought that must have had an almost divine source. We called them muses, right? And music was named music because it seemed uncannily divine and sublime for us as humans to have such a wonderful thing. Even if we had only a little bit, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it? We would take a nice little motet from Mozart and we would sing our children to sleep. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, right? And if we got bored with that, we'd teach them another song. Ba, ba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. The same little motet. And then we would teach them to learn the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, right? One little piece of music, but wouldn't end the world better with that same motet repeated 3 times than if the world had no music at all, right? So music is powerful, it's wonderful. Luther called it, next to the Word of God, the greatest gift God gave us. He wasn't a neurobiologist, he didn't understand why the human alone could appreciate music, but he knew that we did, and that it was a wonderful gift. So anything you read by Daniel Levitin is good, but the current book, The Organized Mind, is about thinking straight, as he says, in the age of information overload. And so it's pertinent to our thesis and so forth. Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death was the first work on media ecology that lay people could read with great benefit and just couldn't put it down. And so if you want an introduction to one of the great media ecologists of the last century, he died in 2003, Neil Postman is the person to read. Tony Reinke's on the staff at Bethlehem Baptist, where John Piper is. He's been with Piper for 15 years now, I think. And he wrote a very, very thoughtful book, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You, several years ago. And he's quite familiar with the media ecological literature, demonstrates real facility with it. So you'll find that to be helpful if you're interested. Christine Rosen used to be the senior editor at The New Atlantis. And she still writes for them from time to time, but she doesn't have the editorial responsibility she used to. And her myth of multitasking gives neurobiological evidence for why multitasking does not exist. The human brain cannot do more than one thing at a time. It has difficulty walking and chewing gum at the same time, but it can't do anything complex, anything mental. All you do is you waste time switching back and forth, and you waste mental energy switching back and forth. And so that's, if you're interested in that very narrow question, read her article. Felicia Song teaches at Westmont in California. So she's a good Christian woman, and she's trained in both, I think primarily social psychology, and she calls her book Restless Devices, and rediscovering or recovering personhood, presence, and place in the digital age. And she's also very familiar with the literature and media ecology, and it's a very well-written book. Mary Swingles in Canada, I think, even though her book is published over on the Pacific Coast, I think, however, that she may be on the East Coast. I think she's in Montreal. She's a clinical psychologist, and so she calls her book iMinds, How Cell Phones, Computers, Etc. are Changing Our Brains. and our behavior, and so forth. Jean Twenge, it's pronounced Twenge, it looks like twinge. Jean Twenge's at San Diego State University, and she's written a more recent book called Generations about how you distinguish X from Z and those kinds of things. But her first book that made so much splash was iGen, Why Today's Super-Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. So the first part of that title is so attractive, isn't it, right? Less rebellious, yes. More tolerant, yes. Less happy, oh. And completely unprepared for adulthood. This is no good at all, right? And her essay, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation in Atlantic, that also, like Nicholas Carr's thing, is a précis of the book. So if you don't want to read her book, read her Atlantic article, and you get the substance of what appears in fuller form in her book afterwards. It's a very, very good thing. And then Marianne Wolf spent most of her career in Boston at Tufts University, where she was director of the reading lab, and she's a neurobiologist. So she gave her entire career to the neurobiology of the reading brain, and all of her books are about that. She's now in California, somewhere within the university system there, and she's also the director of a reading program. One of her sons is dyslexic, and either her father or grandfather was dyslexic. She also has a personal and familial interest in why and how brains learn, and why reading is easier for some brains than others, and so forth. And she writes just beautifully. She's just an elegant author. So that's the tip of the iceberg of my 20-page bibliography on media ecology, with primary attention to attentiveness and attention. So I thought it would give you something to put a check mark beside, maybe to put on your to-read list, especially the briefer articles by Nicholas Carr and by Jean Twenge if you don't want to read their books. And then maybe that would entice you to read the book. But a good, well-written essay by some of these people will do a lot for you. But at this point, I had pledged that I would stop and entertain questions, because some of what I've said is stuff that some of you already know, and some of it's new. And if some of the newer stuff is stuff that you would like to have pursued a little further, I'd be very happy to do it, as long as Sean permits me to. It looks like he's coming up to pull the mic on me, but I don't think he's really going to do that. So any questions about attention? Yes. Yeah, thanks. The question was about neuroplasticity, and is that grounds for hope, right, for whether we're teaching children or adults. And in my case, for adults, I think about people who are stroke victims. One of the Grove College students that I enjoyed a great deal, she did a degree here at Vanderbilt in Tennessee, and she's a speech therapist. That's what she does now for a living. And probably 80% of her clients are people whose speech has been disrupted by a stroke. And so the good news about neuroplasticity is when people suffer brain damage, it need not and is not always terminal. It need not be terminal and isn't always. There was the famous case of the guy who was working in New Hampshire when they were cutting through the highway system, I think in the 1930s or so. And back then, they would drill holes, and then they would put charges of dynamite in there, and they would pack the dynamite charge in with a steel rod, which just sounds to me like a bad idea, right? This is where the rational part of the brain, I don't think, was working 100% that day. But at any rate, the charge went off, and you may recall the thing went right in his forehead and came out back here in the top back of his head. And they eventually were able to surgically remove it. And he lived, he was an old bachelor at the time. This didn't improve his chances, I don't guess. But he managed to live as an independent adult for the rest of his life and could function. So, and that's serious brain damage, a spike like that going through your head. And so, neuroplasticity means the same way that a cut, if you pull it together close, it may heal up, right? Much of the rest of the mortal body, even in this mortal world, still has regenerative properties to it. And synaptic pathways are developed, like my friend who for months couldn't speak but could sing hymns, and then one day he just started talking again.
But for young adults and they've never developed it, postpartum mental health and hospitals, there's still hope for that.
Yes. Yeah, the same way that these guys will be doing 100 push-ups a year from now, right? They'll start at 20 or 30, and then they'll have a little competition going on, and they'll get to 100. But they won't get there tomorrow, unless they're at 99 today, right? But they'll get there. Yeah, it's just it's the nature of the fact that cells multiply and do what they do, and especially that the synapses in the brain, that's just what they do. They make new connections. And so they do literally workarounds, as it were. They work around defective parts that no longer function, and they find another way of making it work. So this is why I say I think it's the most fascinating field. If I were young, and I barely remember being young, but if I were young, it would be hard to resist the temptation to study neurobiology. It would be just hard to resist it. It's very, very interesting.
A roving mic if there's other questions. That way
There's
everyone can hear
one
you.
back by the
Yes, back here.
pillar back here.
Have there been any studies done on the constant direct input that a lot of our young adults are having now, teenagers with the earpieces, constantly to the exclusion of other input from people around them or from their environment?
Yeah, many studies have been done on it because many young people go to bed with their smartphones, right? And so they continue to watch movies or listen to music or to watch TikTok and so forth while they're supposedly asleep. And so the brain isn't meant to be awake 20 hours a day. And it needs rest from stimulation. And so tons of studies have been done on the fact that if they're in the bedroom, they will ruin your sleep. Yeah, and even there, overstimulation is still an enormous issue because the brain can't process but so much of it. It's an interesting fact, is it not, that when you go to a concert of rock musicians, that they have hearing aids, not hearing aids, but hearing non-aids, right? Joe Bonamassa, good guitarist, and Joe always has stuff in his ears because he doesn't want to lose his ears. And he knows if he listens to too much music and it's too loud, it'll destroy his hearing. And so he protects and preserves his hearing while he deafens his audience. But that's just the way it is. But yeah, roughly what we would say is the current generation is hyperstimulated, overstimulated. It's stimulated beyond what a normal, healthy person can deal with. And some of the consequences, interestingly, are very similar to PTSD, where there's also too much stimulation, right? Frightening stimulation in the case of military. But there's a sense in which just having so much stuff hit you that you can't process has very similar consequences to PTSD. And none of us would want our children to have to go off and fight overseas in a war, but effectively they're almost in a war zone now, unless they choose to opt out. We need to have high school students all across the United States start clubs called Pascal Club, right? Where they sit around and do nothing for about 30 minutes, right? Just kind of sit there and say, let's pretend it's a quiet chamber, right? Be an interesting thing to happen. I'll be the first guest speaker, and I won't even charge.
Dr. Gordon.
How much variation is there in neuroplasticity in adults? Say if two people have the stroke that's the same severity and have the same amount that they need to recover, is it known how much range there is in their neuroplasticity and how difficult it would be for them to recover?
They are studying that all the time. That's what they're studying. They're even studying whether the synaptic pathways between certain lobes of the brain to other specific lobes of the brain, whether they can stimulate that in some way, whether through radiation or through medication or something. Can they actually deliberately help create synapses between two particular lobes of the brain? So they're constantly studying that, but to my knowledge, there's no consensus yet on whether they've reached any firm conclusions. One of the drawbacks, of empirical studies is that they're longitudinal. To be valid, they have to be longitudinal. They have to be reproduced, and they have to prove that they stand up over time. So when I had my stage 3 cancer in 2004, 11 months of treatment, I remember Eileen came in one day and said, "Mr. Gordon, would you be willing to participate in a longitudinal study?" I said, "I've only got a 25% chance of surviving. The longitudinaler, the better." right? What I really wanted was a long study, right? And I wanted to be around long enough to complete it out of commitment to Irene. Yeah, longitudinal studies, part of the problem is empirical studies take so long to yield responsible results. And then if, let's say, this solution were pharmacological, then you'd have to go through government testing and approval. So in other words, the Canadians and the Mexicans will figure this out practically long before in the United States, because they always are a little ahead of us. They have slightly more liberal policies about approving things than we do. But yet they're working on the very matter that you're dealing with. And my former Grove City student, she reads that stuff constantly in her profession. They're constantly trying to see if there's a way that we can stimulate this. The way, they have different kinds of Gatorade for different athletes, right? Some that are better for your strength, others for your breathing and those kinds of things. So what they're trying to do is see if they can locate the precise mechanisms that would assist the synapses to develop well. But I would say that, no, they're not there yet.
Does so-called measured IQ have anything to do with the speed of neuroplasticity?
I don't know that anyone's done that study. Neil Postman was one of those that argued that the concept of IQ is false. And that he said the only thing that the IQ test is how you perform on IQ tests. And so there are a bunch of people who think the whole Princeton apparatus up there is just a money-making venture that makes tons of money for them. Because remember, they used to tell us when we were younger that there's no sense trying to improve your intelligence quotient because you have what you have. But I know firsthand a number of people who increase theirs by at least 20 percentage points. And that's supposed to be impossible to do. If it's a fixed trait, it can't improve. But because of neuroplasticity with many people, it does. They literally get smarter. And Princeton doesn't want you to believe that because Princeton might lose its competitive edge since it now has no competitors at all. If we concluded with Postman that it's all baloney, they would lose their competitive edge.
So you're just learning to take tests better.
Yes, and certain kinds of tests. The ones that are easily measurable, objectively by pencil marks that go across the page kind of a thing. So real intellectual flexibility, I think, can be cultivated because it's an aspect of neuroplasticity. So that's why once or twice in the last 20 years, someone has introduced me as a learned person. And I always correct them, gently I hope, and I say, I'm not a learned person. I'm a learning person, and I don't intend to stop. Right? So some of the books that I've got on my list that I've read are since I retired in 2021. And I'm not teaching at the college anymore, but I'm continuing to learn about media ecology. And I study the Holy Scriptures every day, and I continue to learn. So it's important to me to be a learning person because the longer you are a learning person, the better you become at learning. But the goal of being learned is just silly. Only the Almighty's learned. The rest of us are learning.
So has the digital age produced a greater anxiety overall and therefore a lack of trust in God? If so, and why might that be?
Let me hear the first part of it again. I didn't quite get the first part.
Has the digital age produced a greater anxiety overall?
Oh, my goodness, yes. Some of the authors we mentioned, that's exactly what they've studied. There's a perfect correlation between the amount of time spent with digital devices and mental health. And unfortunately, it's negative correspondence. And that's true of people whether they're 30 or 13 or 70. That is to say, they rattle us. The constant switching from one thing to another disturbs us and leaves us anxious and leaves us in most traditional senses mentally ill. And so part of Jean Twengie's book is that she uses primarily the General Social Survey. So her study only goes back to 1960. But she does have the 80 years or 60 years between there and the present. And she says that young people today are safer than they've ever been. No generation alive has ever been as safe as the ones born into the third millennium. Their likelihood of suffering a physical assault of any sort is extremely rare. And yet they fear suffering violence more than any group before. There's a complete disproportion between the external reality and their perception of that external reality. They feel less safe, they're more anxious, and yet they're far safer than they've ever been. Isn't that crazy? It's really paradoxical. So the digital world unsettles. I think that's what it does. Because it isn't Pascal's quiet chamber. And if Pascal's right, the quiet chamber is in some sense necessary for our health, then the people who don't have any of that space, they've got all of the stuff they haven't been able to field. It would be like having a second baseman out there fielding ground balls, but you've got 8 or 9 men lined up on the third base lines with bats hitting balls at him at the same time. And he's as busy as a 7-tailed cat on a rocker. He just can't handle that much. So yeah, I mean, all the studies at this point, good clinical studies demonstrate that there's a direct relationship between amount of time spent with digital technologies, especially the social media, and mental illness.
Let's do one more question here.
So, question about your belief spectrum. So, I understand prejudice, opinion, and conviction. But could you elaborate a little bit more on belief? Because you have the aware that somebody else or someone thinks it's important. But like, how does that necessarily affect your own?
There are many things that we say that we believe, and probably at some level we do believe, but we do so not because we have studied them. We haven't had the occasion exhaustively to evaluate it, arguments for and arguments against, that sort of a thing. But I think I mentioned the example of the creeds. I think that's a good example of one where if you ask someone, do you believe that God is the Father Almighty and the maker of heaven and earth, the person would probably say yes. And if you took each of the clauses, Jesus Christ, his only Son, who was born of the Virgin Mary, and say, do you believe that he was born of the... Yes. Suffered under Pontius Pilate? Yes. Right? I think most people would say yes to everything on there. But they might have only studied one of them or two of them. But it's a belief because they are conscious, so it's not just a prejudice. And it's more than an opinion because they recognize that the confessing Christian churches have said this, right? This is regarded as an important thing to believe. And as far as I know, I agree. But it's not yet a conviction. They probably wouldn't die for it yet. Thanks for the question. That helps. And you may have had one right here on the end in the blue shirt.
So is there any way to increase neuroplasticity? Like I see people say, well, brush your teeth with your left hand or something like that. And is that quantifiable and beneficial? So how do you go about increasing or measuring it?
Yeah, at this point, I don't know that there's any consensus of an answer to that yet. There are many people who commercially sell products that are ostensibly brain healthy, designed to facilitate brain growth. But I don't think we've had sufficient medical evidence yet for the USDA to approve those, for instance. So I think we're still in the early stages and don't know if there's a way to do it. I do know that learning fosters learning. That if you cultivate a learning mind, you find it easier to learn a year later because you're constantly learning. And people who learn to learn faster. And that's more like the push-ups these guys will be doing next year. That the more they do, the better they'll get at it. Yeah, I'm expecting a lot from you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. If you have further questions, by all means, keep those in the back of your mind. Hold on to them. We're going to have a Q&A time after our lunch together, so you're welcome to ask those questions verbally, or if you'd rather not, if you want to write them down and on a slip of paper and give it to me or to Dr. Wilborn, we'll be happy to field those. But if you have other questions that weren't answered or something else that just popped up as you were sitting here thinking, hold on to those. We'll have a good Q&A session after our lunchtime. You may have heard Dr. Wilborn mention yesterday evening a few of the books, and I just wanted to highlight them for you. The Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns by Dr. Gordon, the one that preceded that, Why Johnny Can't Preach, and then his most recent one, Choose Better, 5 Biblical Models for Making Ethical Decisions. Now tomorrow during the Sunday school hour, he's going to give us, Dr. Gordon is going to give us basically a digest of this whole book. And so, but I still commend it to you. It's very accessible. I won't give any more previews on it just now since that's what we're going to talk about during the Sunday school hour, but this is a great introduction to ethics. I think it's accessible for even high school seniors, college freshmen, and beyond, so that's worthwhile. And Why Johnny Can't Preach and Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns. These are affordable little monographs. You can get them on Amazon for $10, $12, $13. If you don't want to give your money to big, evil Amazon, I think WTS Books and other outfits like that will sell them. And Why Johnny Can't Preach, it's not just for preachers. I mean, I read this as my first textbook in my first introduction to preaching class with Dr. Ian Duguid way back when at the college. But even if you're not a preacher, you will benefit from this volume because it has everything to do with Christian discipleship and how we learn and what, the central act in Christian worship of preaching God's word. Why are we so negatively able to receive that in our day and age? This is a helpful volume. And along those lines, same thing with Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns. Even if you're not a preacher, we all sing. All Christians congregationally sing together, and so you'll benefit from this one as well. And you'll come to find out that our Christian devotion and piety being shaped by singing as it is, why are we ill-equipped to do this well in our day and age? It has less to do with preference than you might think, and so this is a wonderful volume that you'll benefit from greatly. I have a spare copy of Why Johnny Can't Preach that I'd be happy to give away, so if you want a copy of this, just hit me up during the break time, and I'll be happy to pass this along to you. But I think that we're about ready for the lunchtime. What I'll do, yes.
Just a moment.
Yes, sir.
I just happened to think, last night he peddled Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and that's the first edition. It is. And if you'd like to borrow it, you may sign a little card, and I'll stick it in my box so I can keep up with it, since I didn't keep up with my Why Johnny Can't Preach. But it's here. I've got it. You can borrow it. Another one, Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology, which goes along with this whole thing as well. You're welcome to borrow one, you can borrow one at a time. Or two of you can borrow one at the same time, okay?
You'll notice that Dr. Wilborn is only offering to let you borrow his books. I'm willing to give you all this one to take home. So, no, what we're going to do is, and again, a huge thanks to all of you for bringing in the different items to share for our fellowship luncheon. A huge thank you to the Women's Fellowship Committee for feeding us so well with that smorgasbord of snacks yesterday evening. It's been a wonderful time. So what we'll do is, like we do on the first Sunday of the month, I'll pray, and then we can begin fellowshipping, and when we get the all clear signal from out there that they're ready for us, we'll just proceed through the buffet line like we typically do. And so I'll pray now, we'll eat for a while, and then I think what they'd like us to do is make our way back in here at the appropriate time for the Q&A session, and then that'll conclude our time together. So why don't I start with a word of prayer, and we'll go from there. Our Father, thank you again for this day you've given us. Thank you for this time together. Thank you for all this good food that we are about to receive and enjoy, for those who've prepared it. And we pray that you would bless it to our nourishment, bless our fellowship and conversation and cultivating of friendships and renewing of friendships around the table. And again, we pray your blessing on all these things we think about and talk about this weekend, that it would be to our edification, to our growth in grace, to our growth as Christian disciples, and to your glory. We give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.